The Post-War Life of Ulysses S. Grant. Let us have peace. Throughout its history, this nation has celebrated several of its victorious military leaders by electing them to the presidency. Notable figures prior to the American Civil War include George Washington, Andrew Jackson, and Zachary Taylor. This narrative recounts the life of another such leader, a man who, like the president he served, emerged from modest beginnings to attain the highest office in the land. This individual faced political campaigns that proved to be as formidable, if not more so, than his military endeavors. Drawing inspiration from William McFeely's biography, this account focuses on Ulysses S. Grant, who played a crucial role in securing victory in the American Civil War, and subsequently sought to establish lasting peace. The final 5 letters of the word history spell story, and it is essential that history is conveyed in this manner. Merely presenting numbers and dates lacks depth. Such approaches render history lifeless. History is vibrant and pertinent. Welcome to Threads from the National Tapestry, a series that shares narratives from the American Civil War. This series will highlight significant events and individuals from that era, aiming to immerse you in the experience and demonstrate that history is indeed a narrative. On Monday, April 10, 1865, the man who had successfully cornered Robert E. Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia sent a telegram to his wife, assuring her he would return home in time for dinner. Thus, Lieutenant General Ulysses S. Grant journeyed to City Point, Virginia, where Julia and the wives of his staff prepared meals and awaited their return. As the evening unfolded, filled with anticipation, the women engaged in music and dance, only to confront the disappointment that their husbands would not arrive as expected, ultimately retiring for the night. Julia awoke the following morning to find her husband standing beside her. The previous day, their train had experienced multiple derailments. When she inquired about Richmond, her husband expressed his reluctance to visit the former Confederate capital, as he did not wish to contribute to the city's suffering. Instead, the couple journeyed to a jubilant city in Washington, where celebrations were in full swing. Bonfires blazed, rockets soared, bells rang joyfully, and spontaneous speeches filled the air. It was Thursday the 13th, and approximately 1,000 freed slaves gathered on the grounds of Arlington. They sang songs of jubilation. Unbeknownst to them, Grant checked into Willard's Hotel before proceeding to Army headquarters, where the demobilization process commenced. The following day, Friday the 14th, he participated in President Lincoln's cabinet meeting at 11 a.m. During the meeting, the president warmly congratulated Grant and inquired if there had been any updates from Sherman in North Carolina. Grant replied that he had not received any news but anticipated communication soon. The president then shared a recurring dream he had experienced aboard a unique, indescribable vessel swiftly approaching an unknown shore. As the meeting concluded, Grant received an invitation to join the president and his wife at the theater that evening. However, he later sent a message expressing gratitude but declined the invitation, as Julia wished to visit their children in Philadelphia. It was in Philadelphia, around midnight, that the tragic news of the president's fate was communicated via telegraph. The general returned to the capital and spent the next 2 days making arrangements for Lincoln's funeral. He ordered an African-American regiment from Richmond to serve as an honor guard. Additionally, he organized the ceremony scheduled for Wednesday the 19th in the East Room of the Executive Mansion. Grant always remembered Abraham Lincoln and later reflected, "He was incontestably the greatest man I have ever known." As for the new president, Andrew Johnson, Grant had only a limited acquaintance with him. After Johnson had completed his tenure as military governor of Tennessee, Grant experienced a complex array of feelings towards him. He perceived the 17th president as someone who harbored a vindictive nature. Indeed, Johnson had expressed to Lincoln his dissatisfaction with Grant's lenient terms offered to Lee. On the evening of the 21st, Grant participated in a cabinet meeting convened by Johnson, during which Sherman was criticized for his overly generous terms to Joe Johnston at Durham Station in North Carolina. Both the new president and Secretary of War Edwin Stanton exhibited considerable bitterness during this discussion. In an effort to alleviate the tension, Grant volunteered to travel to Raleigh, North Carolina, opting to do so discreetly to spare his friend any embarrassment. He arrived unexpectedly on the morning of April 24th. While in Raleigh, he penned a letter to Julia, reflecting on the immense suffering that would persist in the South in the coming year, despite the war's conclusion. He noted that those advocating for further retaliation and punishment either failed to grasp the extent of the suffering already experienced or were devoid of compassion, preferring to remain safe at home while others bore the brunt of the consequences. Although the war was effectively over, military operations continued. In late April, as General-in-Chief, he summoned Major General Philip Sheridan and assigned him command of a 50,000-man force tasked with securing the surrender of any remaining Confederate troops in Louisiana and Texas. Additionally, Sheridan was discreetly instructed to provide support to the Juarez government in Mexico to assist in dismantling Maximilian's unwelcome French regime. In June, Grant made a visit to New York City. His previous visit in 1854 had left him destitute and disheartened. At that time, he had been discharged from the United States Army, facing unemployment and an uncertain future. Now, he returned to the city as a celebrated national figure. Following this, he and Julia journeyed up the Hudson River to West Point, where he participated in the commencement ceremonies. It marked his inaugural visit since his graduation in 1843. As he mingled with his former instructors, they observed the great chieftain to be both reserved and respectful. Prior to his departure, he paid a visit to the 79-year-old Winfield Scott, who welcomed him adorned in full military attire. Scott had just released his completed military memoirs and graciously gifted Grant an autographed edition, which bore the inscription, "From the oldest to the greatest general." Grant then proceeded to Boston, where he was presented with an impressive array of leather-bound and gilt-edged books. Crowds gathered along their route, and at each hotel, the couple was celebrated with music and cheers. Business magnate and philanthropist William Henry Vanderbilt provided the use of his private railroad car. Honorary degrees were conferred upon him. The Victory Tour continued to Chicago, where he participated in a benefit aimed at supporting disabled soldiers and sailors. The reception in the Windy City surpassed that of New York City. Following this, he made a brief return to Washington City before embarking on a journey through New England and eastern Canada. On August 18th, he arrived at his adopted hometown of Galena, Illinois. During the war, he had been inquired about his political ambitions post-conflict. He had replied in the negative, but mused that he would not mind serving as mayor of Galena, stating that his first initiative would be to install sidewalks. As the triumphant general entered the town, he passed beneath arches adorned with greenery, where a prominent sign proclaimed, "General, the sidewalk is built." Gifts began to pour in. His neighbors presented him with a house. Following the warm welcome, he anticipated a genuine homecoming. He then visited his parents, Jesse and Hannah, who resided in Covington, Kentucky. Upon entering, he found his mother in her apron. She looked up and remarked, "Well, Ulysses, you've become a great man, haven't you?" before returning to her household tasks. As previously noted, the gifts continued to arrive, with each presenter seemingly striving to surpass the last. During an unplanned tour, the triumphant general was presented with 14 horses. Upon his return to Washington City on Friday, October 6th, an influx of gifts expressing gratitude arrived from various sources. The city of Philadelphia bestowed upon the general an opulent residence. Former Major General Daniel Butterfield, who represented New York merchants and had connections within the financial sector, gifted Grant items valued at $104,000. Grant accepted all the gifts, including horses and homes, without hesitation, perceiving them as tokens of appreciation from a grateful nation for his commendable service. In reality, no laws were violated or manipulated, and the gifts were transparent and legitimate. However, reflecting on his pre-war struggles, it was indeed remarkable that affluent individuals now sought his companionship. Financier Jay Cook, among others, sought his counsel. Additionally, another residence was gifted to him, located at 205 Uy Street in Northwest Washington City, accompanied by a sum of $75,000. It is noteworthy that as these gifts and wealth accumulated, the distinction between right and wrong appeared to become increasingly ambiguous for him. As time progressed, it became evident that with the accumulation of wealth, his common sense seemed to diminish. Furthermore, on July 25, 1866, Congress established a new military rank, and U.S. Grant was honored as the first four-star general in American history. His relationship with the current president, Andrew Johnson, contrasted sharply with the rapport he had enjoyed with Lincoln. However, the context had shifted. Military endeavors had transitioned into political pursuits, and Grant found himself in demand from both political parties. During this period, his relationship with Johnson began to improve, which Grant welcomed, as he sought to mitigate the tensions he faced with Secretary of War Stanton. In November, Johnson requested Grant to undertake a fact-finding mission in the South. Grant departed on November 27th, visiting Virginia, the Carolinas, Georgia, and Tennessee, before returning to Washington City on December 11th. Upon his return, he informed the president that he was convinced the majority of thoughtful individuals in the South accepted the current state of affairs in good faith. However, he also believed that military presence in the South would be necessary for an extended period. To Andrew Johnson's dismay, Grant maintained that the Freedmen's Bureau was essential for the protection of former slaves. By this time, tensions had escalated between Johnson and the 39th Congress, placing Grant in a challenging position. While he was required to follow executive orders, Grant held the view that the primary responsibility for policymaking resided with Congress. Following race riots in Memphis, he grew concerned that the achievements of the Union victory were at risk. Recognizing the defiance of Southern whites, Grant issued General Order No. 44 in July, directing all Army commanders in the South to arrest civilians for crimes when civil authorities failed to intervene. In August, as the 1866 midterm elections approached, Andrew Johnson resolved to take his opposition to the proposed 14th Amendment directly to the public. He believed the amendment posed a threat to white supremacy. For this unprecedented speaking tour, the president included his cabinet and invited Grant, along with naval hero David Farragut, to accompany him. Dubbed the President's Stump around the circle, Grant was reluctant to participate, but felt compelled to do so, given the president's prior approval of numerous military promotions for his associates. Thus, he joined the tour with reluctance. The outcome was a complete disaster. In his vehement criticism of radical Republicans, the 17th president's speeches were often crude and at times slurred due to alcohol consumption, repeatedly alienating the audience. Allies of certain congressional members conspired to exacerbate the situation. Johnson's assertion that the defeated South remained part of the Union, emphasizing a sense of brotherhood, was met with hostility from individuals hired by radical Republicans who mingled within the crowd, shouting accusations of treachery and deceit. "That's a falsehood. Be quiet." On September 8th in St. Louis, when Johnson addressed the audience, some attendees responded with hisses. In reply, Johnson remarked that Grant felt embarrassed and humiliated. Grant regarded Johnson as a national embarrassment. At one point, both Grant and Admiral Farragut sought refuge in the baggage car of Johnson's train, where Grant resorted to smoking excessively and drinking. Frustrated with a man whom Grant described as attending his own funeral, he feigned illness. He also informed the president of his need to return home for family matters, thus making his escape. Upon their return to Washington, the two men had a notably unpleasant confrontation. By this time, Johnson had become aware of Grant's opposition to his Southern policies and wished to distance him from the capital. The president intended to send Grant to Mexico City for a diplomatic mission to assess Maximilian's situation. In anticipation of Grant's absence, Johnson summoned William Sherman to Washington. Sherman, recognizing the tension, chose to withdraw. The situation escalated on Tuesday, October 23, 1866, during a cabinet meeting. Johnson inquired of Secretary of State William Seward whether Grant's diplomatic orders for Mexico had been prepared. Seward confirmed they were ready and began to read them aloud. At that moment, Grant interjected, reiterating his unwillingness to go, which provoked Johnson's anger. He turned to his Attorney General, Henry Stanberry, and asked, "Mr. Attorney General, is there any reason why General Grant should not comply with my orders?" By this time, Grant was already on his feet, ready to respond before Stanberry could even answer. Directly addressing Johnson, he stated, "I am an officer of the Army, yet I am also a citizen. The duty you request of me is a civil obligation, and as a citizen, I possess the right to accept or refuse, and I choose to refuse. No authority on earth can compel me to comply." The president remained silent. Grant then turned and exited the meeting. The individual who had successfully worn down and cornered R.E. Lee was beginning to grasp the distinction between military and political confrontations. There had been another significant confrontation between the two in June of 1865. In Virginia, Robert E. Lee discovered that a federal grand jury in Norfolk had indicted him for treason. Confused, he reached out to Grant. "Based on the terms established at Appomattox, we are not entirely free from harassment." Grant concurred with Lee's interpretation, but the 17th president had a different view. In fact, Johnson inquired, "When can these individuals be tried?" Grant replied, "Never, unless they breach their paroles." This remark ignited a fierce response. "I would like to understand by what authority a military leader intervenes to shield a notorious traitor from the law." Grant, with a steely demeanor, responded, "I have established specific terms with Lee, the best and only terms. I would resign my command of the Army rather than carry out any order to arrest Lee." No further actions were taken. When the midterm elections arrived in 1866, Johnson and his political allies suffered a significant defeat. Both chambers of Congress now held a two-thirds majority of radical Republicans, sufficient to override any veto from Johnson. In a moment of empathy, Grant encouraged Johnson to seek compromise and reconciliation, but his advice went unheeded. By the end of 1866, U.S. Grant had not fully aligned himself with the radicals, yet Andrew Johnson was undoubtedly pushing him in that direction. In the early months of 1867, Grant found himself increasingly supportive of Congress's anti-Johnson Reconstruction measures. Initially skeptical, he had now become convinced that freedmen should not only be recognized as citizens, but also granted the right to vote. He expressed his support for Native Americans openly. By this time, Grant had aligned himself with Congress, creating a challenging dynamic for Johnson. The president found himself unable to dismiss Grant due to the latter's significant popularity. However, Johnson was concerned that the four-star general might become the next presidential candidate for his party. Despite the existing tensions, Grant maintained a respectful and diplomatic demeanor in his personal interactions with Andrew Johnson. Nevertheless, by August 1867, their official relationship deteriorated. In a bid to undermine Reconstruction officials, Johnson informed Grant of his intention to remove the radical ally, Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, and requested that Grant assume the position. Complicating matters further, Stanton refused to resign. Undeterred, Johnson suspended Stanton and instructed that the office and its files be handed over to Grant. Once again caught in a political conflict, Grant complied with the executive orders and agreed to temporarily take over the office. The president then targeted Union Reconstruction military leaders, Major Generals Philip Sheridan and Daniel Sickles. Grant declined to dismiss them, challenging Johnson by asserting that such actions could only be seen as an attempt to undermine congressional laws aimed at restoring peace. As autumn approached in 1867, a frustrated Johnson sought to replace Grant with Lieutenant General William Sherman, who once again declined to engage in the political conflict. The relationship between Johnson and Grant reached a low point, with all communication between them reduced to formal exchanges. Their mutual disdain was evident. On January 13, 1868, the Senate voted 33-6 to uphold the Tenure of Office Act and reinstate Edwin Stanton. Grant, relieved, willingly relinquished his temporary role as Secretary of War. Ultimately, Andrew Johnson faced impeachment, and throughout the trial, Grant remained an observer, refraining from active involvement. He was summoned to provide testimony, which he did without displaying any hostility. On May 20, 1868, just 4 days following Johnson's narrow acquittal, the Republican Party convened in Chicago, attracting approximately 8,000 attendees at Crosby's Opera House. During this gathering, Major General John Blackjack Logan from Illinois rose to nominate Ulysses S. Grant. The convention erupted in enthusiasm, and the nomination was unanimous. Meanwhile, in Washington City, Grant was engaged at his desk when Secretary of War Stanton entered and informed him of his nomination by the Republican Party for the Presidency of the United States. Grant looked up, absorbed the information in silence, and then accepted Stanton's congratulations with an impassive demeanor. The following day, he formally accepted the nomination via letter in which he endorsed the Republican platform, pledged to uphold the laws, and concluded with the memorable phrase that would be echoed, "Let us have peace." In regard to the election, Grant chose not to campaign. Aware of his limitations as a public speaker, he remained in his role as General-in-Chief while Congress was in session. Once Congress adjourned, he accompanied Sherman and Sheridan on an inspection tour of Western forts. He traveled as far as Denver before returning to Galena, where he was present on Election Day, November 3rd. On that day, he visited the polls alongside his neighbors, casting his vote for Elihu Washburn, his political supporter, and for every Republican candidate on the ballot. Notably, he intentionally abstained from voting for himself. At 10 p.m., he made his way to Washburn's residence, where telegraph equipment had been arranged to monitor the election returns. Throughout the evening, he maintained a calm demeanor, appearing more engaged in a card game than in the election results. By 2 a.m., the telegraph delivered news of his victory. He returned home to inform Julia and then addressed a gathering of 50 to 200 people from his doorstep. His message to them was succinct. "I feel the weight of the responsibilities of this position, but I accept them without fear." The official results indicated that U.S. Grant secured 26 out of 34 states. His electoral triumph was marked by a tally of 214 votes against 80 for the Democratic candidate, Horatio Seymour, from New York. The Republican Party retained a two-thirds majority in the Senate, while their dominance in the House of Representatives expanded to 4/5. Notably, both Republicans and a significant number of Democrats expressed satisfaction with Grant's stance on sound currency, prudent economic governance, and the restoration of the South through congressional reconstruction. 2 days later, he commenced his journey back to Washington, D.C., accompanied by his family and 3 military aides, facing several reported assassination threats, much like Lincoln had. He paid little attention to these threats. Grant arrived shortly after noon on November 7th, without any band or welcoming committee. A public carriage was summoned, and they proceeded to their residence on I Street, as he still had responsibilities to fulfill as General-in-Chief prior to his inauguration. At the age of 46, he became the youngest individual to be elected to the presidency at that time, and it had been since George Washington that a president was so minimally beholden to the political elites of the era. Nevertheless, he had been deeply engaged with numerous pressing issues. He played a crucial role in demobilizing the largest army in the world, maintaining order in the western Great Plains, assisting in the overthrow of Maximilian in Mexico from a distance, and facilitating the transition of approximately 4 million freedmen into a new chapter of their lives. Now he was preparing for his administration with the same meticulous approach he had employed during the Vicksburg campaign in 1863. Like then, he kept his plans confidential and maintained a distance from the press. At 10:40 a.m. on a chilly and rainy Thursday, March 4, 1869, the 18th President of the United States traveled in a carriage to his inauguration on Capitol Hill. For the third and final time in American history, until Donald Trump, an outgoing president, did not accompany his successor. Some accounts suggest that Grant declined to ride with the departing Andrew Johnson, while others claim that Johnson stated he was too preoccupied to attend. At 12:17 p.m., the Marine Band performed the President's March, and Grant, dressed in a meticulously tailored black suit, descended the steps of the East Portico to take the oath of office. He authored his own inaugural address without consulting anyone regarding its content. Comprising 1,200 words, it remains one of the shortest addresses in history, with its message not extending beyond the first few rows of attendees. Half of the address focused on fiscal issues, including the national debt, revenue collection, and the reduction of government expenditures. He emphasized the importance of safeguarding citizens both domestically and internationally, pledging to engage fairly with other nations. His most passionate remarks were directed towards African Americans and Native Americans. Notably, he was the first president to advocate for the rights of Native Americans in his inaugural speech, explicitly expressing his support for black suffrage. While his address received favorable reviews, he did not seek advice from anyone regarding his cabinet selections, not even those he had in mind. For instance, Adolph Bory of Philadelphia, who had donated over $50,000 towards one of Grant's residences, discovered his appointment as Secretary of the Navy through a newspaper article. The following day, the new president publicly announced his cabinet, choosing members based on personal rapport rather than political influence. He selected individuals with whom he felt comfortable, capable of managing their departments and executing his directives with enthusiasm. It is noteworthy that the new president appointed 24 of his relatives to various political positions. A man who had previously participated in only one election ascended to power without a significant cause or deep personal engagement in any particular issue. The U.S. Senate took less than 2 hours to confirm his cabinet nominees. Although there were minor personal challenges in filling all the positions, by March 11th, his cabinet was fully established. Among his nominations, one particularly intriguing candidate was submitted to the Senate. It was not a cabinet position, but rather the role of surveyor of customs at the Port of New Orleans. The individual in question was an old acquaintance, former Confederate General James Longstreet. Additionally, for the Bureau of Indian Affairs, his longtime aide, Eli S. Parker, who belonged to the Seneca tribe, was appointed. His spouse, Julia, emerged as the most beloved First Lady since Dolly Madison. Accompanying them in the executive mansion were their youngest children, Nellie and Jess, along with Julia's 83-year-old father, who remained a steadfast Democrat. Ulysses Jr. was preparing to depart for Phillips Exeter Academy, while 19-year-old Fred was already enrolled at West Point. Following Lincoln's assassination, a secret service was established, but Grant chose to dismiss them. It was not uncommon for him to venture out and walk the streets of the capital unaccompanied. His daily routine began at 7 a.m. with a review of the Washington and New York newspapers. At 8:30 a.m., he would join Julia and the rest of the family for breakfast. Afterward, he would take a walk around the neighborhood before arriving at his office by 10 a.m., excluding lunchtime. He worked until approximately 3 p.m., with cabinet meetings scheduled for 2 p.m. on Tuesdays, typically lasting 2 hours. In the late afternoon, he would either take a drive in an open carriage or enjoy another stroll. It was not unusual for him to make unexpected visits to friends. Despite engaging in daily exercise, he quickly gained around 50 pounds on his 5'8" frame. In terms of his presidential duties, he approached them as if he were still in military command, akin to a general-in-chief, though there were notable differences. During the war, circumstances often deviated from expectations, necessitating improvisation. However, in his current role, lingering issues remained unresolved. While his military leadership might spark debate, his decisions were final. Now he faced the necessity of negotiation and compromise, quickly realizing that alliances were often fleeting. Criticism, backbiting, and second-guessing were ever present. Each decision he made tended to satisfy one faction while disappointing another. Early in his presidency, a decision to reorganize the War Department estranged one of his closest friends, William Sherman. Although they maintained their friendship, the distance between them diminished its warmth. As Sherman expressed, "He is an enigma to me, and I suspect he is an enigma to himself as well." In the spring of 1869, another associate from the war paid a visit. This was Robert E. Lee, who traveled to Baltimore in search of financial support for a railroad project leading to Lexington, Virginia. Before Lee's return, he received a message to visit Washington City. He arrived on Saturday, May 1st, and briefly glimpsed Arlington. Perhaps he contemplated what could have been. He met with President Grant at the Executive Mansion, where they exchanged greetings. Lee explained the purpose of his trip to Baltimore, to which Grant humorously remarked, "You and I, General, have had more involvement in the destruction of railroads than in their construction." The humor did not land well, resulting in an uncomfortable silence. Left alone for 15 minutes, they stood together, shook hands, and the meeting concluded. They would never meet again. The college president returned to Lexington. Lee never spoke of the encounter, while Grant recalled only a few details. His first significant conflict during his presidency arose when he sought the repeal of the Tenure of Office Act, which required congressional approval for the appointment and removal of cabinet and government officials. Grant's approach to this issue revealed an aspect of his presidential style that many historians overlook. Instead of being portrayed as a naive figure, Grant navigated the situation with political acumen. When the Senate hesitated to repeal the act, Grant made it clear that he would adhere strictly to it. He would not dismiss any of Andrew Johnson's appointees and would only fill positions that were unoccupied. This decision meant that Congress would be deprived of the patronage they desperately desired, as there would be no new postmasters, pension clerks, or customs collectors until the Senate changed its stance. Grant's astute management achieved his objectives within a mere 3 weeks. Following the resolution of one crisis, another emerged in September 1869, when financiers Jay Gould and Jubilee Jim Fisk attempted to manipulate the gold market. They believed they had successfully misled President Grant into providing unwitting support for their scheme. However, the president discerned their intentions and convened a meeting with his Secretary of the Treasury, George Boutwell. He directed that if gold prices continued to escalate, government gold should be sold. This directive was executed on Friday, September 24th, resulting in immediate consequences. Grant recognized the scheme and took decisive measures to dismantle Gould and Fisk's gold ring, thereby averting a potential financial crisis for the nation. This action marked the first instance of the United States government intervening directly to restore order to the economy and the marketplace. Nevertheless, the ensuing months saw economic repercussions, and while Grant himself bore no responsibility, it is noteworthy that several of his political associates, including a significant portion of his staff, profited from the situation. Additional scandals would later emerge concerning Western land policies, banking, railroads, and whiskey rings. It is important to acknowledge that although Grant generally trusted businessmen and accepted their hospitality and gifts, he never permitted them to gain an unfair advantage. A brief mention of his foreign policy, often overlooked, is warranted. This oversight can be attributed to historians with a Southern bias, who have depicted him as a clumsy and naive leader throughout his 2 terms. Despite a misstep in his ambition to annex Santo Domingo, Grant successfully kept the nation out of conflict with Spain over Cuba, resolved the Alabama claims with Great Britain, improved diplomatic relations with the British government, and established a precedent for arbitration in international disputes. One could readily draw parallels between his diplomatic strategies and acumen and those of Dwight D. Eisenhower. It is important to highlight that his primary adversary in diplomatic discussions was Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts, with whom he frequently clashed over policy matters. When informed that Sumner, nearing his 60s, did not subscribe to the beliefs of the Bible, Grant expressed little surprise, remarking that he had not authored it. In relation to other pressing issues of the time, President Grant advocated for civil service reform. However, several influential senators resisted these efforts. The overwhelming influence of patronage ultimately thwarted any possibility for progress. It was not until the assassination of President James Garfield in July 1881 that civil service reform began to take hold. In contrast, Grant made significant strides in the treatment of Native Americans, feeling a deep sense of kinship with them. He empathized with their struggles and adopted a policy of peace rather than violence. His genuine desire was to integrate them fully into American society, despite the fact that the 14th Amendment had been deliberately crafted to exclude Native Americans. Grant's approach to this issue astonished both Sherman and Sheridan. Through Eli Parker, he appointed Quakers as Indian agents, believing their religious principles would ensure their integrity and compassion. However, over time, many of these agents succumbed to the allure of greed and corruption. Simultaneously, conflicts between white settlers and Native Americans on the Great Plains persisted. Following the Baker Massacre in June 1870, where 173 Native Americans were killed, leaving only 15 women and children alive, the outraged Wendell Phillips condemned the actions, stating that he recognized only 3 savages on the plains: Colonel Baker, General Custer, and the overarching figure, General Sheridan. An intriguing dialogue also took place between Eli Parker, head of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and Little Swan, a chief from the Great Plains. Parker inquired whether Little Swan had attained the position of chief due to having taken the lives of numerous individuals. The Native American affirmed this, drawing a parallel to the actions of the Great White Father in the White House. In spite of the prevailing tensions, advancements, and obstacles, Grant maintained his faith in his peace policy and the principle of human equality, which, akin to the freedmen, warranted governmental protection. In Grant's perspective, the battle at Little Bighorn in June 1876 was entirely avoidable and did not alter his disdain and lack of regard for George Custer. Ultimately, despite the president's attempts at reform and the provision of equal protection under the law, his peace policy succumbed to the forces of racial prejudice, corruption, avarice, and ineptitude. An unintended consequence of this failed policy was the shared conviction with numerous churches that the Plains Indians ought to forsake their traditional ways and culture in favor of Christianity. Nevertheless, his policy was, for the 1870s, both progressive and humanitarian. Ulysses S. Grant sought assimilation rather than destruction. I would like to take this opportunity to express my gratitude to all who have tuned in to Threads from the National Tapestry. Each episode is the culmination of extensive research and preparation, and it is profoundly meaningful to both me and our production team to witness the engagement through likes, comments, and views. I want to emphasize that all our content will always remain accessible to those eager to learn about the American Civil War. However, we kindly invite you to consider becoming a member, a loyal supporter of Threads. For less than $5 per month, your contribution will enable us to continue sharing our enthusiasm for this tumultuous yet significant era in history. Joining is a straightforward process. At the top of each show description, you will find a link to join, whether you are watching, liking, commenting, or choosing to become a loyal supporter of Threads. Your support for Threads from the National Tapestry, should you choose to click on that link, would be immensely appreciated by me and our team. There is no doubt that any contribution you make will have a significant impact and serve as a meaningful recognition of our efforts. Thank you. This leads us to a discussion of his perspectives on the freedmen and the Reconstruction era. Many portray Grant as a passive president who showed little concern for the welfare of approximately 4 million freedmen and the devastated South. This perception is misguided. His approach to presidential leadership required a robust Attorney General and Secretary of War to implement national policy and ensure protection, which he successfully obtained in the form of his Attorney General, the 49-year-old Georgian Amos Ackerman, and his 40-year-old Secretary of War, William Worth Belknap. Both individuals were dedicated to upholding the law and aimed to safeguard those unable to defend themselves while combating terrorism, particularly from the KKK. Grant was deeply committed to utilizing federal power to dismantle the KKK's reign of terror. In March 1871, he and his entire cabinet made an unusual visit to Capitol Hill to garner support for what ultimately became the Ku Klux Klan Act. Following the Act's passage in April 1871, Grant took decisive action by empowering the military to dismantle the terrorist organization. In October of that year, he declared a state of lawlessness in 9 upland counties in South Carolina, suspended the writ of habeas corpus, and deployed military reinforcements to counter the organization. By 1872, his enforcement of the law had reached a level that effectively curtailed the KKK's influence. A significant reduction in violence and a vigilant defense of civil rights led to an unprecedented turnout of African American voters in the national elections of 1872. This prompted several historians to assert that this election may have been the most equitable and democratic presidential election in the South until 1968. Nevertheless, despite Grant's intentions and efforts, there were individuals in his circle, including former comrades from the war, who sought personal enrichment. By 1872, the Republican Party, which had once been a staunch advocate for civil rights and the Union, appeared to be on an alarming trajectory toward self-serving interests. Grant maintained a reputation for integrity. While he accepted gifts, he never engaged in bribery. He placed trust in businessmen, but ensured they did not gain undue advantages or access. In essence, if he had a shortcoming, it was his tendency to trust friends whom he appointed to positions of authority. Eli Parker, the head of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, attributed Grant's susceptibility to the influence of wealth to his wife, Julia. His longtime associate Sherman pointed to the corrupting environment of Washington, D.C. The rampant avarice within the party reached such a level that by 1872, a schism emerged. Charles Sumner, Jacob Cox, and Carl Schurz distanced themselves from the president and established the Liberal Republican Party, nominating Horace Greeley for the presidency. The nearly 61-year-old newspaper editor and publisher notably advocated for amnesty for all former Confederates, endorsed local self-governance, and criticized Grant's arbitrary actions in the South. In a peculiar turn of events, the National Democratic Party also chose Greeley as their nominee. Once again, Grant opted not to campaign. However, the fundamental issue in the election was that most Northern voters remained hesitant to place their trust in white Southerners or Democrats. On Election Day, November 5, 1872, Grant achieved re-election by a substantial margin, securing 56% of the popular vote, the highest percentage for any presidential candidate from Andrew Jackson in 1828 to Theodore Roosevelt in 1904. He secured victories in every state north of the Mason-Dixon line and in 8 out of 11 states that were part of the former Confederacy. The Republican Party also maintained a two-thirds majority in both legislative chambers. The premature passing of Greeley on November 29, 1872, ensured that the electoral results reflected the popular vote. Consequently, the nation's war hero was granted a second term. This signified another term under a president who was led to believe that criticism was purely political in nature. For him personally, this victory brought immense satisfaction. It represented vindication, marking his pinnacle moment. His popularity reached its zenith. However, similar to FDR in 1936 and Reagan during his second term, a certain level of hubris resulted in errors, which in turn led to ineffective governance, corruption, and scandal. Indeed, this period ushered in one of the most significant chapters of corruption in the history of the nation. Later, when asked what troubled Grant the most about politics, he responded that it was the betrayal by those he had trusted. Unfortunately, he experienced such betrayals frequently. By the time of the midterm elections in November 1874, the Democrats regained control of the House of Representatives for the first time since 1856, also gaining 10 seats in the Senate. Clearly, times were changing. There was considerable resentment in the South regarding Grant's interventions, while Northern voters, frankly, became increasingly indifferent to the struggles and protection of African Americans. In 1876, at the end of a compromised administration, he penned an unusual letter, a farewell to Congress. In this letter, he acknowledged his lack of political experience upon assuming high office, admitted to his mistakes, expressed a desire to have performed better, and affirmed his good intentions. The 18th president found himself ill-equipped to combat the corruption, ruthlessness, materialism, and self-interest of those around him and within the nation. One observer noted, while he liked Grant, he was struck by the poignant expression on his face, a puzzled pathos, as if he were a man grappling with a problem whose terms he did not comprehend. Historically, in a C-SPAN survey conducted in 2000, Grant was positioned as the 10th worst president. In a subsequent poll by U.S. News and World Report 14 years later, he faced criticism once more, particularly regarding corruption, which was deemed his most significant failing among various presidential attributes. This corruption was unprecedented, although it is important to note that he did not personally benefit from it. The context of the post-Civil War era and his leadership style, characterized by delegation, played a significant role in this assessment. As Grant himself stated, his failures stemmed from errors in judgment rather than intent. Recently, his reputation has improved, largely due to his well-crafted presidential memoirs and a revised understanding of Reconstruction history. For instance, Grant is recognized for his vigorous pursuit of reform initiatives in the South. He is commended for his backing and enforcement of the Ku Klux Klan Act and the Civil Rights Act of 1875. While these laws were contentious from the perspective of Southern whites and yielded only temporary benefits for freedmen, they represented a crucial initial step during a challenging period. His commitment to the rights of African Americans and Native Americans was both honorable and, at the time, courageous. Additionally, he was known for his calm demeanor, impartiality, profound respect for the law, and personal integrity. In the most recent evaluation, a 2021 CSPAN survey of historians now ranks him as the 20th best president in U.S. history. When considering his presidency within the context of the 14 presidents who served from 1849 to 1901, Grant is rated as the third best, surpassed only by William McKinley and Abraham Lincoln. On May 27, 1875, the Republican Party in Pennsylvania nominated him for an unprecedented third term, which he declined. At that time, the nation was grappling with the economic repercussions of the Panic of 1873, alongside the emergence of the whiskey ring scandal in early 1875, and additional land fraud issues within the Department of the Interior. Amidst the tumult of scandal that besieged his administration, he maintained his composure at the helm, exhibiting remarkable calmness. Notably, future U.S. President James Garfield commented on his remarkable steadiness, expressing uncertainty as to whether it should be regarded as greatness or folly. The Republican Convention convened in Cincinnati on June 14, 1876. While some, particularly from Pennsylvania, advocated for a third term for Grant, he chose to remain silent and on the periphery. Consequently, the party turned its attention to another Ohioan and fellow Northern Civil War general, Rutherford B. Hayes. The 1876 election is often remembered as one of the most contentious in American history, comparable to the controversies surrounding the 2000 presidential election. Throughout the political turmoil and clandestine negotiations that characterized this election, Grant exhibited a commendable level of calm and nonpartisanship. Upon transferring the office to Hayes, he remarked, "I feel like a boy getting out of school." Garfield again observed, "No American has left the White House with greater favor than this quiet man who departs today." The Grants did not vacate the executive mansion until late afternoon on Inauguration Day, as they were reluctant to leave. They contemplated returning to their modest home in Galena, which had been gifted to them. Additionally, there was the house on I Street in Washington City. However, the $6,000 pension proved insufficient to sustain both their lifestyle and the property. As a result, the Grants opted to embark on a global journey at their own expense as long as their savings of $85,000 permitted. Accompanying them would be Julia, their younger son Jesse, a maid, a manservant, Adolph Bory, the former Secretary of the Navy, Bory's nephew who was a physician, and 37-year-old John Russell Young, a writer for the New York Herald. Through his perspective and writings, the nation would, in a sense, accompany the 18th president and his entourage, who were indeed keen to follow a figure still held in high regard. They departed on Thursday, May 17, 1877, without a predetermined agenda or itinerary. Their journey would span 2.5 years, during which they would embody the principles of American simplicity and democracy. This expedition provided an unprecedented opportunity for the public to witness him, surpassing any previous historical encounters. Primarily, he was received not merely as a president, but as a generalissimo, celebrated as the hero of Appomattox and the most renowned soldier of his time, representing a military titan of a burgeoning nation. Hundreds of thousands of individuals and dignitaries likened him to Hannibal as they made their way to Liverpool. Their stay included a visit to Scotland's Castle of Argyll, followed by a journey south to London, where they were honored with dinners, balls, and receptions hosted by notable figures such as the Prince of Wales, the son of the Duke of Wellington, and other members of royalty. Queen Victoria graciously hosted the Grants as overnight guests at Windsor Castle. Crossing the Channel, they arrived in France, where the martial president hailed him as one of the 3 greatest soldiers in history, omitting the names of the other 2. Nevertheless, they continued to Belgium and southern Germany, where Wagner performed for them personally. During this time, he had the opportunity to meet with Otto von Bismarck, the first Chancellor of Germany. Amidst the grandeur surrounding the Marshal, Grant humbly stated, "The truth is, I am more of a farmer than a soldier." In Pompeii, captivated by the natural wonders, authorities excavated a house for his visit, where they discovered a loaf of bread among the ruins. He was captivated by architectural wonders and had a profound appreciation for art galleries and museums. Although he received numerous invitations to review various military units, he chose to decline as often as possible. The journey then proceeded to Palermo, where they boarded the USS Vandalia on Christmas Eve to embark on a Mediterranean cruise. While aboard, they passed by Stromboli, a place where sirens had once lured another Ulysses. Julia, however, reminded him that this time Penelope was at his side. The trip had taken on a life of its own. Each host felt compelled to surpass the previous one. In Alexandria, the Khedive offered his palace on a flat-bottomed steamer for Grant's use. For 3 weeks, they navigated the Nile with the director of the National Museum at their service. They rode camels to view the statues of Egypt's founder, Memnon. Subsequently, the Grants traveled to the Holy Land. Between Hatha and Jerusalem, they were shown the site where David gathered stones to defeat Goliath. Their journey then took them to Constantinople, where in Athens, the Parthenon was illuminated by 1,000 fires. In Italy, the Grants had the honor of meeting King Umberto and received an audience with Pope Leo XIII, who bestowed a blessing on the diamond cross Julia wore, a gift from Grant, on their 25th wedding anniversary. Couple at 3 East 66th Street, just off Fifth Avenue, provided him with a steady income and offered some railroad bonds. After years of public service, Grant struggled to adapt to private life. In search of financial prospects, he and his son, Ulysses Jr., known as Buck, decided to establish a brokerage firm with the Wall Street financier, Ferdinand Ward. Each contributed $100,000, while Ward added $200,000. All members of Grant's family invested as well. The firm of Grant and Ward opened its doors at Wall Street and Broadway, experiencing a prosperous period from 1881 to 1884. Some investors enjoyed annual dividends as high as 40%. Ward's financial acumen increased Grant's wealth to approximately $2.5 million. However, some of Grant's former allies expressed concern. Sherman found it undignified that Grant seemed primarily focused on financial matters, while Sheridan was left perplexed. Perhaps they were aware of something that others were not. On the occasion of the 20th anniversary of the commencement of Grant's overland campaign, on May 4, 1884, Ward publicly announced his urgent need for funds to sustain a bank that held $660,000 of the combined assets of Grant and Ward. Ward claimed to have secured $250,000 and inquired if Grant could assist in raising an additional $150,000. Grant approached William Henry Vanderbilt, known for his Republic be damned reputation, and although the Commodore was somewhat indifferent towards the bank and brokerage, he ultimately consented to lend Grant the required funds. 2 days later, on Tuesday, May 6th, Grant entered the office to find his son in a state of distress. Buck exclaimed that Grant and Ward had collapsed and that Ward had absconded. The Wall Street figure had orchestrated a massive fraud, which turned out to be a pyramid scheme. The initial investments, including the $200,000 that Ward claimed to have raised, were entirely fictitious. The financial liabilities amounted to over $16 million, while the assets were a mere $57,000. Upon receiving this devastating news, Grant's demeanor remained unchanged. He turned deliberately and returned to his office, where he sank into his chair, gripping its arms tightly. He reflected, having dedicated his life to trusting individuals long after others had lost faith, yet he found it difficult to trust anyone again. Overcome with emotion, he buried his face in his hands. That evening, he returned home with only $80 in his pocket, while Julia had $130 at their residence. Although he could not settle the firm's debts, he regarded his personal obligations as a matter of honor. For instance, Vanderbilt offered to forgive his debt, but Grant declined the offer. To address his personal liabilities, he sold various items, including ornaments from hats worn at Belmont and Fort Donelson. He parted with shoulder straps from uniforms he had donned at Vicksburg and Petersburg, a gold model of the table from the McLean House, a pen used for writing orders, 40 gold medals, swords, and gifts collected from his travels, as well as his commissions from second lieutenant to 4-star general. True to his principles and commitments to his friends, Grant fulfilled every one of his personal debts. Ward was apprehended, tried, convicted, and sentenced to a decade in prison. As Grant and his family faced the looming threat of financial ruin, an unexpected opportunity emerged. Century magazine commissioned him to write 4 articles on the Civil War, offering $500 for each piece. His initial article focused on the Battle of Shiloh and was merely a reiteration of his official report, lacking depth and personal insight. However, his subsequent rewrite infused the piece with personal stories and anecdotes. Initially uncertain about his writing capabilities, Grant discovered a newfound enjoyment in the process, which was evident in the revised Shiloh article. Its success prompted the magazine to propose that he write his memoirs. Simultaneously, Samuel Clemens, who was preparing to publish Huckleberry Finn, learned of Grant's offer from the magazine. He was taken aback by the proposed advance, expressing his mixed emotions about it. Clemens visited Grant's townhouse in New York City, where Century magazine had offered $30,000. In contrast, Twain proposed an advance of $50,000 along with a promise of royalties. Grant accepted Twain's offer to publish his memoirs, but declined the full advance, opting to take only $20,000 as he began crafting what would become the personal memoirs of U.S. Grant. In the summer of 1884, while in the midst of research and writing, he experienced excruciating pain after biting into a peach. Although advised to consult a doctor, he hesitated. It was not until October 22, 1884, that he finally sought medical attention, perhaps out of denial. When he inquired whether he had cancer, the diagnosis was confirmed. The doctor explained that the condition was serious, epithelial in nature, and occasionally treatable, but its location rendered surgery impossible. By mid-February 1885, the ulceration had progressed, and the tumor had grown from the size of a pea to that of a plum. By late February, he was enduring severe pain in one ear as the cancer continued to advance. By early March, the individual experienced nausea, headaches, and insomnia. The lesion appeared as an angry shade of scarlet. To alleviate the discomfort, hydrochloride of cocaine was applied to his ulcerated throat. Swallowing liquids proved to be a significant challenge. The pain was so intense that he once gasped in agony, likening the sensation to molten lead coursing down his throat. News of his condition began to circulate. The headline of the New York World on March 1, 1885, proclaimed, "Grant is dying." This announcement ignited a flurry of scheming among reporters eager to be the first to announce the general's passing. One reporter secured a cord around the ankle of a house butler, allowing for easy access to information through a window. Another devised a plan to launch a series of skyrockets from the Grant residence, which would set off additional rockets down the street. These fireworks would trigger the printing of pre-prepared articles. A different reporter charmed a housemaid across the street to gain a visual vantage point from an upstairs window. These journalists referred to themselves as members of the 50 Million Club, a nod to the estimated number of people nationwide who would be interested in the news. On April 1st, Reverend John Philip Newman was summoned to baptize an unconscious Grant. All believed that death was near, yet a hypodermic injection of brandy into his unconscious body revived him. Remarkably, his health began to improve. He remained resolute, refusing to concede defeat. Like a military strategist, he persisted in working on his memoirs while death loomed closely. On several occasions, he encountered news articles announcing his demise. After reading an obituary written prematurely, he would set the paper aside and return to his writing. On Decoration Day, a precursor to what we now know as Memorial Day, which was celebrated around the anniversary of Appomattox, the 7th New York Regiment arrived at Grant's residence to perform a serenade. Grant, upon hearing the music, appeared at a window. A gathering had formed alongside the regiment, and those present caught sight of a frail, stooped figure clad in a black skullcap, a dark dressing gown, and a gaunt gray face. The moment he was seen, a collective gasp arose from the crowd. Undeterred, the colonel of the 7th raised his sword in a gesture of respect. As children were lifted for a better view and men removed their hats, the ailing warrior managed a faint, thin smile, slowly waved and retreated from the window. At this point, each day was a torment. Whenever he attempted to rest by lying down, saliva and bloody mucus would flow down his throat, causing him to choke, compelling him to remain seated upright in a leather armchair. His diet consisted solely of mutton and beef broth mixed with milk and eggs. Swallowing this mixture was excruciating. Coughing fits forced him to clear his throat, persistently expelling bloodied saliva. The swelling in his neck had become so pronounced that he could no longer fully open his mouth. Morphine was his constant companion, leaving his arms and legs marked by needle punctures. Yet, astonishingly, he managed to write or dictate up to 10,000 words each day. He literally fought against death with one hand while writing with the other. While awake, he maintained a stoic demeanor. It was during his sleep that the depth of his suffering became evident. By June of 1885, the heat in the city had become unbearable, and on Tuesday, the 16th of that month, a frail U.S. Grant made his way through Grand Central Station. The group accompanying him boarded Vanderbilt's private train and set off for Sarasota Springs, specifically to Anthony Joseph Drexel's cottage, situated atop Mount McGregor. The train's route included stops at Poughkeepsie, Ryancliffe, and Hudson. As they passed West Point, Julia pointed out the scenery. He smiled in response. Just north of Albany, at a curve in the river, the train made a brief stop. Adjacent to the tracks stood a flagman's shack, positioned directly beneath Grant's window. The general observed the structure and saw the flagman emerge. The flagman approached the car and locked eyes with Grant. Slowly, he raised an arm that was devoid of a hand. Then he spoke, expressing his relief. "Thank God I see you alive, General Grant." As the train began to move again, the flagman continued to follow. He glanced at his war injury and remarked, "I lost that with you at the Wilderness, and I would sacrifice the other one to see you in good health." Inside the car, Grant's expression tightened. He swiftly removed his hat and nodded in acknowledgement to the veteran. Tears flowed from everyone present. Their destination was a 2-story cottage located 12 miles from Syracuse, facing east towards the Green Mountains of Vermont. He intended to sit on the front porch, continuing his work and writing, as he could no longer engage in conversation. While guards kept onlookers at bay, Women curtsied, men took off their hats, and children sang. In his chair, his sleep rarely extended beyond an hour. To alleviate his suffering, cocaine was applied to the back of his throat. Each day, he received 4 or 5 morphine injections in his arms, legs, and chest. Despite enduring immense pain, on Thursday, July 16th, 1 month after his arrival at Mount McGregor, Ulysses S. Grant completed his memoirs. He wrote, "It seems that man's destiny in this world is quite as much a mystery as it is likely to be in the next. I had never envisioned attaining a rank within the profession for which I was trained. However, I found myself elevated by 2 grades above the ranks of general officers. I had no aspirations or inclination towards a political career, yet I served as President of the United States on 2 occasions. I have now authored a book. I possess an abundance of skills, which has hindered my ability to excel in any single one." Despite enduring significant discomfort and fatigue, he managed to produce approximately 275,000 words in less than a year. His memoirs achieved remarkable sales, reaching 500,000 copies, twice the number sold of his publisher, Mark Twain's Huckleberry Finn. A year later, Clemens presented Julia with the largest royalty check ever issued at that time, amounting to $200,000, with more to follow. Over 300,000 sets were sold, resulting in total royalties of $450,000. These payments restored financial stability to his family. His literary work proved to be both a financial and artistic triumph. He had completed his penultimate campaign with only one remaining, the campaign of life itself. Upon finishing, he remarked that there was nothing further he could do, and thus he felt prepared to depart at that moment. On Monday, July 20th, he expressed a desire to visit a nearby gazebo, but to do so required him to rise and take 3 steps. This proved to be too taxing. He returned, pale and faint. The following day was oppressively hot, accompanied by bouts of hiccuping, leaving him too weak to grasp his cane. That evening, he longed to escape the confinement of his chair, and they assisted him into bed. It was there, around 8 a.m. on Thursday, July 23rd, that U.S. Grant finally succumbed. Weighed down to less than 100 pounds, Grant, like Robert E. Lee, who had passed away 15 years prior, was 63 years old. The family decided to transport him back to New York City by train. Along the journey, pennies were placed on the tracks as keepsakes. There was a stop in Albany, marked by a grand procession. Upon returning to New York City, he lay in state. Mourners arrived from all corners of the nation. President Grover Cleveland, former presidents, 20 state governors, and both former generals and privates attended. The funeral was the most magnificent military and civil spectacle in the history of the nation. The procession extended for 7 miles and lasted 5 hours, culminating in the Claremont area of Manhattan at Riverside Drive and 122nd Street. This event honored the man who, in 1854, provided U.S. Grant with the financial means to remain in New York City and return to Galena following his resignation from the United States Army. This same individual was present when Grant achieved his initial significant victory at Fort Donelson, where he had previously surrendered. Simon Believer Buckner attended, as did the current commanding general of the Army, Philip Sheridan. Ex-Confederate General Joseph E. Johnston was also in attendance, alongside William Sherman, who had retired from the United States Army just a year prior. As he stood by the casket, Sherman, a close ally and friend, wept. The man who had brought about the quietude at Appomattox had now been silenced. 12 years later, on Saturday, April 17, 1897, Grant's remains were discreetly moved to an 8.5-ton red granite sarcophagus, which was subsequently placed in the mausoleum now known as Grant's Tomb. The monument was dedicated 10 days later, on Tuesday, April 27th, with an attendance exceeding 1 million, led by President William McKinley. This day held symbolic significance. It marked the 75th anniversary of Grant's birth. Julia frequently visited the site. On one occasion, she unexpectedly encountered a woman who stepped forward and embraced the former First Lady. Gently, the stranger introduced herself as the wife of Jefferson Davis. Both women returned often, united in their shared experiences. Perhaps they both noticed the simple four-word inscription etched into the granite. This phrase, taken from Grant's first inauguration, conveyed a sentiment and a hope that remains as pertinent and significant today as it was then. Let us have peace. Thank you for listening. We look forward to our next episode.